Through the 1940s and 50s, filmmakers continued to adapt and evolve the popular tropes from domestic set thrillers of the time, like Gaslight and The Cat and the Canary. But these films continued to add darker and more sinister twists, which began to slowly establish the prowler in the house format. Stories about women being preyed upon in their homes by dangerous men. In 1946, RKO produced a psychological thriller about a mute woman who is pursued by a serial killer in a large house. The film, The Spiral Staircase, would go on to become hugely historically important, not just in the evolution of home invasion films, but also the slasher movie.
Hello.
A few years later, Alfred Hitchcock made a 3D adaptation of a play by Frederick Knott about a woman, played by Grace Kelly, who is attacked in her home in the middle of the night by a mysterious strangler. And while both films played on the idea of outsiders invading the home, both films ultimately suggested that, as with films like Gaslight, the real monster was inside the house all along. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss Robert Siodmak's The Spiral Staircase and Alfred Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munter, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th series exploring the evolution of home invasion movies, and this is part 5. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we're going to be looking at 2 creepy thrillers from the 40s and 50s, The Spiral Staircase from 1946 and Dial M for Murder from 1954. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific. Give them both a watch before you listen to our discussion. So joining me to discuss these 2 classic thrillers, I've got a brand new guest, somebody I've been really excited to have on the podcast for a very long time. She is a writer and critic and author, among many other things, and I am invading her home virtually because she's all the way over in Australia. A very warm welcome to Alexandra Heller-Nicholas. Hello, Alexandra.
Hi there. Thank you for having me. This is fun.
This is so exciting. I'm glad that we managed to make this work. We're on opposite sides of the world, and it was all a bit confusing, but thank God we're both here. So thank you so much for being here.
We did it. I knew that we'd get there, but we did it.
First of all, just for anyone out there listening who may not know anything about you, Alex, just tell us a little bit about kind of who you are and what you do.
I'm a film critic. I guess most of my work is in books. So I've published 8 books on cult, horror and exploitation film, often with through the lens of gender politics. So I've written a couple of books on rape revenge film. I wrote a book called 1,000 Women in Horror. And I've written books on masks in horror, found footage horror, and monographs on Dario Argento's Suspiria, Robert Harmon's The Hitcher, Abel Ferrara's Ms. 45. And I'm a columnist for Fangoria magazine, which I love doing. I'm a film critic for the Alliance of Women Film Journalists. And I do lots of stuff. I keep busy. I do lots of home entertainment as well. Yeah,
you're so busy. This is amazing. Tell me, you've got such a vast knowledge of the genre. Where did it begin for you? Do you remember your sort of horror origin story of when you first fell in love with the genre?
Yeah, I have two versions of this story. The one that I thought was true was I was raised Catholic, and my parents are lovely people. They weren't kind of awful Catholics, but they were quite strict about the kinds of film that we were exposed to. So we actually grew up with quite a wonderful exposure to things like Hitchcock and, the classics, lots of musicals, lots of Westerns. But I wasn't allowed to watch what my friends were watching, which of course was, Nightmare on Elm Street and the Police Academy movies. And that's the stuff that I wanted to watch. So my introduction to horror, I thought, was very much through the kind of the slumber party circuit, the girls on the weekend. But just before my mother died a few years ago, she mentioned, just in passing, she said, "Do you think seeing The Exorcist when you were 7 weeks old had an impact on you?" What do you mean 7 weeks old? It's like, your aunt was babysitting you, and she sort of thought you were small enough, so she just took you to the cinema with her. And it's like, yeah, I actually do think that probably had an impact.
Oh my God. Do you have a kind of weird reaction now when you watch The Exorcist? Is there something kind of deep embedded in there?
Well, there is. And I thought that it was because I was such a sort of biological Catholic. So I'm not a Catholic, but I'm, that kind of, anybody that kind of was raised Catholic will know it's really in your DNA, just aesthetically.
It certainly is.
So who knows? Like, I thought that was just, the kind of lingering remnants of Catholicism in my body, but it could be this sort of, early memory. I don't know.
I love it. So in this particular series of the podcast, we are covering what seems to be, for so many people I've spoken to, one of their most upsetting, frightening, triggering subgenres in a lot of ways, the home invasion subgenre. What are your thoughts, Alex, on home invasion movies generally?
I was fine with them when I was younger, and the older that I get, the more they distress me. I'm absolutely of the church that I find like they're the one subgenre that I just sometimes can't face.
Yeah.
It's literally too close to home, right? Like, it's something so kind of there's no metaphor. It's like somebody's going to break into your house and hurt you. There's no metaphor there. There's not a supernatural aspect to it. I mean, obviously there can be, but I think of The Entity as a home invasion film.
Oh my God,
as much as a ghost film. I think that The Entity is a great home invasion film.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like every now and then a home invasion film will come along, and they're the only films that I go, you know what? And I just can't face it. I had a really, and I know that I'm not alone with this, but a really, really intense experience with The Strangers.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a film that fascinates me because I still can't quite put my finger on why it has such an incredible impact on people. But I remember sitting down and watching that, and with the first person sort of arrives and knocks at the door. Those of you who've seen the film will know what I mean. I mean, the film starts off in such a heavy way. It's a couple. I think the guy proposes to his girlfriend and she says no. So it starts off really heavy anyway. Mm-hmm. And then there's a knock at the door, and I remember watching it, and it's like, I just can't face this. I just can't do this.
Yeah.
And I've never seen it. I'm sure it's an amazing film, and I've never watched it again. It was just, and it's not because I thought it was a bad film. It was just like, I can't do it.
Yeah.
I emotionally can't do it. And there's no, I mean, I've written books on rape revenge film. I can watch, I don't mean to sound glib, but, I can switch into work mode for film when I need to.
Mm-hmm.
And watch, the found footage book had a section on snuff film or, fictional snuff film. So, I'm not squeamish, but yeah, something about The Strangers, it just...
Yeah, I totally know what you mean. There's something about movies like The Strangers and movies from that era. I find that too. It took me a long time to first watch The Strangers because I sort of knew what I was in for with it. I'd heard about it. And there was something about that feeling of sitting down to choose to watch that film. And you're right, you watch that first act and you're like, here we go then. This is it now. This is where we're going to be for the next 90 minutes. And rape revenge films have usually absolutely traumatic first acts, but then I suppose at least often that eventually you're going to get to a kind of catharsis potentially, right? Whereas movies like The Strangers, spoiler alert, don't really have much catharsis, right? I think that's the other thing.
And it's that, and it's a feeling that I love in horror when you're watching a movie and you just genuinely have no idea where it's going to go.
Yeah.
And I think home invasion films tend to, it's such a simple setup, but in a way that means there's a lot of room to play.
Yeah.
And there's a danger, I think, or a kind of volatility built in that you don't know that everybody's going to end up okay.
Yeah.
There's only there's only so many things that can happen during a home invasion film.
Yeah.
And a lot of them aren't good.
Yeah.
And it is the fact that the metaphor's just stripped away. It's, you don't have that comfort of hiding in, zombies or, there's not that sort of there's not that fun bit that you can sort of default to as an alternative.
Right, exactly. I think it's... Do you think that, we're going to see a change or a surge in this kind of subgenre? I'm kind of interested in how horror is going to react to sort of everything that's happened across this world over the last 2 or 3 years. The fact that so many of us have spent so long locked up in our homes, and what the home kind of means to us now, and maybe how it's changed for a lot of people, from being maybe something that was quite a safe haven to maybe being something more like a kind of prison for a lot of people that was kind of stuck in their homes, involuntarily. And I'm kind of interested to see how that's going to affect the home invasion subgenre kind of going forward. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think that we'll have, who knows? It's such a dynamic genre. It's always hard to second guess. But my instinct is that people aren't really interested in literal pandemic films.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily want to watch movies about people in lockdown, because I think most of us just want to move on from that. And, the obvious sort of pandemic zombie aspect, I think, is almost too literal.
Yeah.
But what I think, and I think we've already started to see it. I think the fact that Host was so big during lockdown. Host, I think, it works really well through the lens of a supernatural home invasion film.
Yeah.
Like The Entity, right? So on one hand, Host was a novelty because it was, we're all on Zoom and here's a horror movie set on Zoom. But I do think that there was something perhaps deeper than that in how it resonated, which is the way that entry into our home spaces can occur. Doesn't have to be physical. Like, it can be this sort of digital connectivity.
Yes.
This sort of virtual abstraction opens up a whole new kind of pathway into home invasion. So I think maybe not literally like found footage or things like Host, but I think it will be sort of more abstracted ways into the ideas surrounding the pandemic.
I love that. And what are your thoughts? I'm keen to ask you, Alex, in terms of, you're a film historian. You know a lot more about this kind of stuff than I do, but home invasion movies and how far back they go, because it feels to me we've been kind of exploring the evolution of how this subgenre came to be and exploring the way in which perhaps their origins are from the kind of spooky old dark house movies, I suppose, kind of domestic set thrillers that slowly throughout the 40s into the 50s become darker and lean more into horror with a capital H, right? So we're kind of working our way through that. What are your thoughts on those kind of pre-home invasion movies, I suppose? And how far back does this subgenre go, as far as you're aware?
We can go back to something like Lois Weber co-directed a film in 1913 called Suspense, which I think is not just the proto-home invasion film. It's a proto-horror film because if you've seen it, it's just got this crazy split screen action. Like it's like De Palma on acid. It's amazing.
Oh, wow.
And it's a short film. It's on YouTube. And it's really, she co-directed it with somebody called Philip Smalley from memory. And it's a woman at home or the husband is out, and there's like, it's not the most progressive storyline, perhaps from a contemporary perspective. I think it's like a homeless man who's like being dodgy, and she's inside with the baby. Oh, my baby, my baby. But what's so interesting about it is that Weber didn't just co-direct it, but she also stars in it. She also plays the woman. So, we have sort of women there right at the start of home invasion film history. So, obviously horror films go back to the silent era. But, The Lonely Villa, the D.W. Griffith film from 1909, I think, is often considered the first home invasion film. And again, we have this very gendered space, the women on the inside, the men trying to get in. Will the man save them? Will another man save them? They're really interesting films to watch. So I think the films that we're talking about, in a way, whether consciously or not, are sort of already working on these traditions.
Yeah.
Sort of riffing on ideas that had already been sort of explored, I guess, in the silent era.
That's so interesting. And, like the ones you've mentioned there, and a lot of these kind of early movies from the silent era in the 30s and 40s, they are often focused on women. Is that purely because of the time they were made, that was more associated with, being in a domestic space? It would be more likely be a woman, do you think? Or are there more reasons to that as to why these films are often so focused on women particularly?
Yeah, I think it's just a gendering of the domestic space, this sort of traditional idea that, the men or masculinity is linked to a kind of public space, whereas women are linked to a kind of private domestic space.
Yeah.
But the horror of home invasion, when it does center around this sort of feminized domesticity, is that undermines the men too, because the threat, the women are there to keep the home nice, and if that feminized space is in danger, then men themselves are the victim of that, because they're kind of oasis, their place to rest, with the gentle wife is corrupted or is at risk. So and I think it's also this idea that women are the sort of more vulnerable, all of these sort of cliches that riddle cultural history, more innocent. Yeah. That if there's a man who gets his home invaded, then it's sort of, toughen up, princess. Whereas if it's a woman, it's like, the sort of swooning kind of image of the, but I mean, these films do play with that too. I think those kind of ideas are also experimented with and kind of subverted, and that's what horror does so well. And even with the films that we're talking about that aren't capital H horror, they're still playing with these same ideas. And I do think that horror at its best can be really transgressive and really subversive in how it sort of gently sort of drills in and tweaks and plays and manipulates these assumptions and this baggage that we still bring to gender on film.
Exactly. Well, I think that's all going to be really interesting to discuss, particularly in this first film we're about to talk about, right? So let's get into it. Let's discuss The Spiral Staircase from 1946.
There's been another murder.
Yes, so I've heard.
What I want to say is that we've traced the murderer to this vicinity.
Are you certain?
Yes. That's why I've come here. That's why I'm asking everyone to be careful. Keep your doors and windows locked tonight.
Well, I'll see that your orders are carried out, Constable.
I'm especially worried about that girl who works for you.
Helen?
Yes. You see, every one of those girls murdered had something the matter with her. Something wrong.
Oh, you mean some sort of an affliction?
Yes. Now, my hunch is that this murderer, whoever he is...
I understand exactly what you mean, and I assure you that I shall be especially careful about Helen. As a matter of fact, I'll see to it that somebody is with her at all times.
Good.
All right, so the film is set in early 20th century Vermont, a little small town, and there's basically a serial killer who's targeting women with disabilities. And the film follows a mute called Helen, who's played by Dorothy Maguire, and she's the living companion to a very wealthy woman called Mrs. Warren, who's played by Ethel Barrymore. And so she's sort of set up, Helen is set up as like the next victim. And it's about how people in the household deal with that reality and how Helen herself deals with that reality.
Yes, exactly. Tell me first of all, what do you think of this film generally, Alex, and sort of what's your own history with it? When did you first come to it?
So I came to this through research. It's a really important film when we start thinking about the history of mute women protagonists, especially in rape film. So this film predates Johnny Belinda from 1948, the Jane Wyman and Lou Ayres film, which is more explicitly about rape. But in that film, we have the mute rape survivor. And that becomes a really strong thread through rape revenge films, especially, but also films like Speak from 2004 with Kristen Stewart. But, obviously things like Miss 45, the Abel Ferrara film, Thriller, A Cruel Picture. There's this Savage Street, the Linda Blair film. I think her sister in that is a mute from memory. The figure of the mute rape survivor it really permeates rape revenge especially, but also just films about sexual violence more broadly. And this is sort of ground zero for that. Even though it's not a rape film, I do think that there is a sexual dimension to the violence in this film. And I think that very quickly evolved, into something more explicit later on.
Interesting. That's such an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about it in relation to rape revenge films, because one of the things that I've sort of been thinking about as well is that in relation to other home invasion movies I'm studying later on down the line, like Wait Until Dark, like Hush, there is also this element of women who are differently abled or have disabilities, a blind woman, a deaf woman, a mute woman under threat in their home as well. And this also felt like a kind of early forerunner to that as well, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think we have a sort of pretty simplistic, women by virtue of gender, women are supposedly vulnerable. But if you add into that an aspect of disability, then they're more vulnerable, and it sort of ups the stakes of the drama. Perhaps it's not always that cynical. I don't want to make any sort of sweeping generalizations, but I do think most of the time that would be the logic behind it, in that it sort of ups the vulnerability of the woman in crisis or under threat.
Absolutely, yeah. What do you think of the film generally? Do you still think it works? Does it hold up as an effective kind of horror or thriller, in your opinion?
I do. I mean, I think just even to look at, there's this. It's visually quite striking, and the way that the killer is shown with just this sort of eyeball, is quite ahead of its time in a way. I think that this film is quite. It's really interesting to watch because you can really see the legacy of it, even, or the influence of it. And that influence might not be direct, but you can see what things have sort of, been pulled out of this film and borrowed later.
Yeah, for sure.
So, yeah, I think it's really compelling. I think it's a really, it's a hugely influential film. It's a hugely important film. But I also do think that just in terms of sitting down and watching something, if you've got a hangover, it's a bit of a banger.
I think it's a banger as well. I really, really enjoyed it. I'd only watched it for the first time when researching for this podcast and discovering it. And I had a great time with it. I love it. And you're right. I love the way this movie looks. It's directed by Robert Siodmak. Is that how I pronounce that?
I call him Siodmak, but I'm not sure if that's the...
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's the correct... He was on he was a great director anyway, but this came out the same year that he did the Hemingway adaptation of The Killers. And he also did a great film with Olivia de Havilland called The Dark Mirror. So he was on like a winning... he was a strong filmmaker anyway, but he was on a real winning streak during this particular period. And it just, you watch it and it feels like it's a film made by somebody at the top of their game. Like it's really got that sort of polish and confidence to it, that it's like, okay, this isn't a first film.
No, you're absolutely
This isn't somebody
right.
learning the ropes. This is somebody who's really in control of their craft.
The way it's shot and lit as well. The cinematography, Nicholas Masaraka, I think his name is, who is also, this is an RKO film. He had done the cinematography for a lot of the Val Lewton films, like Cat People. And I feel like it's got that kind of look, these kind of beautiful sort of dark shadows and hallways and that kind of thing, and I love the way this movie looks in that regard.
Absolutely. The Val Lewton parallel, I think, is a really solid one.
Yeah.
You could easily mistake this for a Val Lewton film, I think.
Yeah, 100%. What about this main character of Helen then? What do you make of her as our sort of mute protagonist and this performance by Dorothy Maguire?
She's great and she carries the film. And I think it's really interesting in that just in terms of the style of performance, it's super interesting to think about in terms of that early cinema tradition, and because she doesn't speak, there's something almost quite, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but there's something almost quite sort of pantomime-esque about her performance. Like it's very gestural. Yes, it's not necessarily stylistically, it's not the kind of performance style that you would see today. For a mute character. She's her hands are up, in her face all the time, and, her eyes, big eyebrows and big eyes, and they're constantly moving. So it's very, very heavily gestural. But I think that sort of suits I think that it would feel weird in a contemporary film, but this isn't a contemporary film. So something about the dynamics of that, I think, give it an almost, it's not a supernatural film. It's very much of this realm. But there is this sort of, these echoes of, German expressionism, I think just through her performance. And clearly, things like the use of shadows in the film is very much, indebted to that legacy as well. But her performance style, I think in particular, seems really sort of a continuation or a sort of knowing continuation of those kinds of acting styles.
Yeah, I almost wondered if there was like a kind of deliberate... I don't know, a kind of throwback to early silent cinema in this. Obviously, the movie begins with people watching a silent movie in a little, like, sort of little Nickelodeon type thing. And I kind of feel like it almost is channeling in her performance, like you said, and the kind of shadowy German expressionism look. There is something of a kind of silent cinema vibe about this film, isn't there?
Yeah, and critics have really run with that. I've gone blank on the person's name, so forgive me, but I think there's there's one reading of the film that it's almost like a kind of an allegory of the shift from silent cinema to talkies.
Yeah.
So that's sort of an aspect that people have very much picked up and run with. And that opening scene, which is where Helen goes and watches a silent movie at the start, it is a really interesting choice to include that. It's sort of, I think that it's sort of inviting us to sort of read this through the history of read it through film history.
Yeah.
It's a really curious element, actually, that I don't think I've quite wrapped my head around. I don't personally buy I don't buy that this is the whole film is like an allegory for that shift. I'm not sure whether I buy that.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's something in there that is significant to think about.
Yeah, I think so. It does feel like a deliberate choice, right? That 90% of the movie is just in this house, but he chooses to have that opening sequence with this kind of cinema moment. It does, like for whatever reason, there's a deliberate choice being made there, I think, isn't there? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Speaking of the house, I mean, obviously, with every movie we're talking about in this particular strand, the house itself is so important, to a home invasion movie. Just the look of it, the type of build, the geography of the space. What do you think of this? This is your kind of big classic Gothic house, I suppose, in a lot of ways, isn't it?
It is. And I think that what is so masterful about Siodmak's direction is that he starts off on the vertical plane. Mm-hmm. And then as the film gets more intense, he starts off on the horizontal plane. And as the film gets more intense, it shifts to a vertical. The action takes place on a vertical plane.
Interesting.
So it becomes more intensively up and down the stairs.
Yeah.
And it's almost like this sort of disorienting shift from a horizontal sort of logic to this vertical logic. And when you kind of watch, the last sort of, maybe not the last third, maybe the last quarter of this film, it's all taking place vertically. It's all up and down, up and down, up and down, rather than side to side, side to side, side to side, which is where it starts. And then it goes somewhere very differently. So just in terms of this sort of basic spatial logic, even not even taking into things like production design and aspects like that, there's something really consciously at work in this film about distorting or disrupting our sense of space in a really, really primal way, a really, really simple way. And it's so simple that I don't think that we're aware of it. Mm-hmm. But it's only when you sort of take a step back and you realize it's like everything's up and down. It's a totally different logic at play. It's really, really effective.
Yeah, I never really thought about that, but you're so right. And of course, that as that title suggests, the spiral staircase itself is so prominent, and every moment we get to those moments when characters are descending down that staircase into that kind of dark space at the bottom of the house, you can read again. It's just got such a beautiful kind of palpable atmosphere. I feel like I love all of those moments. When we descend those stairs and go down into the depths of the house,
which is the classic Gothic. The depths of the basement. But it also feeds in, I think, just the imagery of the spiral staircase also feeds back into that sort of German expressionist aesthetic as well. So, it's really teasing out these sort of other ideas or these other aesthetic concepts and themes. I mean, it's a classic Gothic horror film.
It is.
Aside from everything else that it is, it's very classically Gothic.
It absolutely is. Yeah, that dark, foreboding basement, but then also the upstairs too, where we go up to the bedroom of Mrs. Warren, Ethel Barrymore, and there is something, again, almost a bit Miss Havisham-esque about this woman upstairs in this bed, isn't there? And she's such an odd character, isn't she, as well? What do you make of Mrs. Warren?
So she's probably, I think, the character for me that carries the film the most in a way. Even, I don't know, I think she almost challenges Dorothy Maguire. I mean, when I watch a film and I think about performance, my little rule of thumb is, can I imagine somebody else in this role? And I have to say, Maguire is solid, but I can imagine other people in that role. But when it comes to Ethel Barrymore, I can't imagine anyone else as Mrs. Warren. I mean, she was at the top of her game. She was I think she'd already won an Academy Award by this time for Best Supporting Actress. I think it was for None But the Lonely Heart. She was really, an extraordinarily accomplished actress by this time. And there's something about her character that is there's like this tug of war that she's very knowing. And you know, and we realize at the end of the film that, yes, she does have this knowledge. But it's a character type, the sort of, the invalid in, the aged invalid in the bed, that should be this sort of meek victim character. And she sort of really rejects that, but she doesn't go to the other extreme where she's just this mean, harsh old lady.
Yeah.
There's real complexity to her character. There's this genuine affection that she has for Helen and this genuine desire to protect her. But also sort of, you can see her really sort of juggling the knowledge that she has about what's going on in her own family. She's a really complex character. I really do think that she carries the film largely.
I agree. Her moments are so striking and interesting, and like you say, the dynamics of the different people at play in this house and how they react to her. The kind of interesting relationship between her two sons, right? Her son and her sort of foster son, Albert Warren and Stephen Warren, right? These two are kind of, again, like, it's very textured. Like, you feel like you get a glimpse of a kind of history of this family as well in those moments,
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, these sort of dynamics, with Blanche.
Yes.
In there, these sort of, it's almost going more into the sort of family melodrama. George Brent, I think, is really solid as Albert. Mm-hmm. It's a really it's a good, solid George Brent performance. But yeah, I do like these more sort of melodramatic aspects of the film. Because I think there's a temptation to just sort of dismiss it as almost like a sort of soap opera component when we contrast it against the sort of the more intense drama around the serial killer and around Helen's supposed vulnerability.
Let's talk a bit about the serial killer then. There is this kind of interesting kind of whodunit, I suppose, element, of who is this prowler. I love it. Apparently it was Robert Siodmak himself that played the eye of the killer that we see throughout, right? Which also kind of lends into that theory that this is kind of about cinema in some way as well, I think. It's kind of interesting, right? That kind of element of voyeurism. But what do you think of these serial killer, these more thriller elements and this kind of whodunit mystery that kind of bubbles over?
I didn't know that about Siodmak. That's great. It reminds me of Dario Argento always playing the gloved killer.
Exactly.
It's his hands, that sort of, I guess it's made even more literal here. The kind of, the violence of the scopophilic gaze, right?
Right.
All that sort of stuff, the gendered gaze and the violence of the male gaze becomes quite literal when it's the director's eye.
Yeah,
right?
I love it. It makes me think a bit of Peeping Tom or something as well. Just that idea of the director's eye kind of looking in. But yeah, it's great. Very, very
that
cool.
sort of voyeuristic.
Yes.
And it's shot so well. I mean, the way that eye is shot is really dramatic. Look, I really like, I guess I just sort of like serial killer films,
I do.
There's something about it that it reminds me a lot of these other films that have this sort of unspoken but very strong influence in the prehistory of slasher. So I'm thinking of stuff like Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd.
Yeah.
I think those two novels in particular don't really get the kudos that they deserve when it comes to where did slasher start.
Totally.
But you can feel that sort of Agatha Christie vibes in this. It's not an adaptation, but you can definitely feel that sort of that influence. But it's also messier. Agatha Christie really liked these really great structural riddles.
Yes.
And this feels, and I think this comes down to it being ultimately a film about domestic violence. To be reductive, it's messier. Mm-hmm. There isn't that structured gameplay vibe. It's not. And then there were one.
No.
Then, it's not this sort of controlled villain. It's not a controlled serial killer. You do get the feeling that there's a kind of frenzy, which adds this really unspoken dimension, I think, of something being really off. This isn't, it's something that it's very hard to articulate, and the film really dances around it. But there's something about the way that the killer kind of works in this is this really frenzied, busted process. It's not this sort of conniving, controlled killer. It's somebody who's really out of control.
Totally. Yeah, you're right. And particularly when we're in literally those moments of the killer's point of view, and everything can go a bit kind of skewed and odd, even visually in those moments, right, as well. Yeah, you're right. There's this kind of genuine kind of unhinged frenzy, as you put it, is perfect, I think. And I really like that. And it does kind of add a creepy element. And this is 100% right. I mean, I agree with that. I know a lot of people have often cited that and have written about it as a kind of forerunner or a sort of proto-slasher in a way. And you can totally see that here with this, can't you? Even mentioning Giallo too, but it feels like so interesting that there's such a kind of through line, I think, to eventually arrive at the kind of, the kind of traditional slasher at the end of the 70s. It's really interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it also, as I said, it also feeds into rape revenge film. In a really interesting way, sort of via Johnny Belinda. I think if you're doing, I don't know why you would, but if you were doing sort of, generic family trees or sub-generic family trees, this is a film I think that would turn up more times than than you would expect. For a film it's not unknown, but it's also not a super famous film.
No.
But I do think it's one of these kind of fundamental quartets, and as we've said, this film feeds from these other traditions as well, these early cinema and the Gothic and German Expressionism. I think that you mentioned these amazing images where we see from the killer's perspective, we see Helen without a mouth. And these are like Louis Buñuel. Like there's a real surrealist tradition there, this really concrete surrealist sort of imaginary going on there. So I do think that there's all these threads that feed into this on one side and then sort of branch out on the other.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of more melodrama element to it, but also this feeling, it reminds me a bit, I think last week we talked about Gaslight, and there is also that kind of, these kind of domestic thrillers where a woman is trapped in a house, the monster is somebody in the home with you, as opposed to an intruder. It actually turns out to be someone in this house, doesn't it, as well? And again, there's a kind of interesting through line there from Gaslight and beyond, I think, which is kind of interesting too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's so interesting about this film, and it does tie, I think, in interesting ways to the more concrete, quote unquote, slasher tradition, in that it's, like I said, this is a film about domestic violence ultimately. The killer's previous victims were not in the domestic space, but the climax of the story is that it's coming from, there's not somebody out there trying to get in. They're already in.
You've been through enough. You tried to telephone, didn't you? I'm glad you couldn't. You looked in this mirror once before today. I watched you. You had no mouth then, just as you have none now. Look at yourself. Look!
Absolutely, yeah. Let's talk about that. There is that, of course, the reveal at the end that this serial killer murdering afflicted women is in fact George Brent's character, right? Albert Warren, who lives in this house with our heroine. He kind of seems to be the most friendly, amiable person in this house as well. But of course, he turns out to be the deranged lunatic. Did you find that effective, that kind of final act and that reveal of Albert to be the killer?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it really kind of Hitchcock's Psycho is quite rightly, considered, the first modern horror film, so that big burst in 1960 of Eyes Without a Face, Peeping Tom and Psycho, like bam, let's kickstart the modern horror film. And the thing with Psycho, of course, is, it's the horror's coming from inside the home, that it's not an external othered threat out there, that the horror is already in the house. And I think that this film predates that in a way, it sort of leads into that. That Hitchcock didn't necessarily sort of create that in a vacuum. I think films like this and Gaslight, sort of precursors to that idea that the horror is inside the home.
Absolutely. And this is what I find so fascinating. This is what I love about doing this podcast, is that you can see that evolving, that trope, right? Like you said, it starts with movies like Gaslight, those kind of domestic abuse thrillers. It kind of evolves slightly here to The Spiral Staircase, where it plays more on the kind of serial killer body count aspect. And then, of course, like you said, that goes through to Psycho. We see it come all the way through to fruition with, of course, movies like When a Stranger Calls or even Black Christmas. That idea of the call is coming from inside the house, right? That often with home invasion, that evil is already in the home. And I think that's a really fascinating element of this film. And again, like, you can see how important this film is it's continuing those themes that were clearly already popular in Hollywood. 2 years earlier, Gaslight won a bunch of Oscars. It was really critically acclaimed, and you can see that it's continuing in that vein of kind of women-centered thrillers. It's set in the domestic space, but this movie just adds a few more little touches of what we now come to know as modern horror, right? And you can really see that, especially in some of the set pieces, in some of those kind of murder set pieces, like the scene when Blanche is killed in the basement.
Oh, it's you. You scared the life out of me.
That really does feel like a kind of classic slasher set piece, doesn't it? As Blanche is our first victim, and her going, "Oh, it's you!" That feels like Friday the 13th almost. That kind of killer point of view shot. The characters talking to them, but we don't know who it is before she's then brutally murdered. And that whole set piece feels like a classic horror moment almost, doesn't it? I think. And actually, speaking of Blanche, let's talk a little bit about the supporting players in this film as well, because this house is filled with quite a lot of people, right? What do you think of the rest of the cast in this film?
Elsa Lanchester, I think, is amazing, and I'm appalled that we haven't brought her up.
I know.
I mean, she's not an essential character. It really is, character actor insert here.
Yeah,
but she's so great, right? She just chews the scenery in any scene that she's in, and she just adds that dimension of fun.
Yeah,
the scenes with I think it's Mrs. Oates and her husband. They're fantastic. The film could possibly do without them. I don't know, but they add so much color. And Blanche is really interesting. That's Rhonda Fleming. And then again, I think like the slasher, she's almost offered as like, "Oh, you're dead." Like she's like victim fodder.
Yes.
She's sort of presented as like, "There's no way you're going to survive because you're a beautiful woman. You're sort of relatively negligible when it comes to the plot."
Yeah,
we can like you kind of identify her immediately as like, okay, you're going to be killed.
Right. That's so interesting. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It did also feel like a kind of forerunner to that as well. And the fact that she was potentially in a sort of sexual relationship as well. Again, that kind of feeds into that kind of slasher archetype or stereotype, doesn't it? As well as like one of the first victims or whatever, The
promiscuous woman.
Yeah, the punishment almost element of it, And
I think the one character that I could probably do without, although I don't know how the film would work without it, is the Dr. Parry character.
Yeah.
Played by Kent Smith. There's a kind of romance line that runs through it between Dr. Parry and Helen, that he's very much the man that will come and save her. And, Ethel Barrymore as Mrs. Warren is she pleads with him. She's like, "You've got to get her out of here."
Yeah.
So that's made quite concrete. I don't know, maybe I'm being harsh, but I could sort of take or leave him.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. He doesn't really need to be there. And also, maybe one of the elements that is, I don't know, maybe slightly more dated than the others is his treatment of her as a mute woman too. This kind of thing of, oh, if I just shake it out of her, eventually she'll be cured, and the way he treats her and the way he's like, you got to face up to your past and then you'll be fine. And of course, at the end of the film, that is sort of the case, right? That she lets out that big scream and then she's miraculously cured, like what do you think of that element to it and the way that her being mute, I suppose, is kind of treated throughout the film?
It's interesting because that's picked up a lot in Johnny Belinda as well. The idea that the idea that the man will cure the woman.
Yeah.
Even something like Ida Lupino's Outrage, which she's not a mute in that film, but it's very much about this sort of professional male figure in that film. It's a priest who will sort of put her on the right track and sort of lead her back. It's interesting because I think there's a lot of talk at the moment. There's noise on social media about horror and trauma.
Yeah,
but horror's always been about trauma. I mean, PTSD I don't think was defined until 1980, but that doesn't mean that people weren't making films about the phenomena, even if it didn't have a name.
Right.
And this film, I think, is a pretty clear-cut example of that. Like, clearly she has PTSD. They wouldn't have used that language at the time. Yeah, I mean, you can decide whether you want to approach that through kind of a contemporary lens, but to me that's not particularly useful.
Yeah.
I think it's more interesting to look at this film in the context of when it was made and talking, kind of cobbling together, I guess, this sort of early language to talk about trauma. And yeah, it may be, you know, it's perhaps a little simplistic from a contemporary perspective, but I don't think that means that it's a simplistic film or a simplistic representation. I think it sort of adds to the history of this complex figure of, you know, of the trauma survivor.
Agreed. And I think because it's such a compelling, interesting performance from Dorothy Maguire as well, I think that kind of adds something to that character, you know, as well, that kind of
absolutely,
yeah, gives it a bit of substance, I think, as well, doesn't it? Yeah. Amazing. Well, there you go. I mean, this movie, like we've talked about, so kind of historically important, clearly. It's, you know, what, like sort of 70, 80 years old nearly now. How do you think this movie just kind of holds up watching it today? Is this still a horror movie or a thriller that you would kind of recommend to people in that way?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think especially like film noir, like if you've got a kind of taste for the sort of more gothic end of film noir, you know, and I do think that, you know, I think it's really, even if you're not in a kind of critical headspace, I think it would be really difficult to watch this film and not think about, oh my God, this is like an early slasher film.
Yeah, 100%.
You know, I just think it would be impossible to kind of miss that. So there is almost a sort of a novelty to it on that element, you know, from that perspective. And in that, yeah, I don't, you know, it's not talked about like Gaslight.
It's not,
about.
Is it? Yeah.
You know, it's really, and it's really, I think, as strong a part of the history.
Yeah, completely agree with you. Yeah, and I think, like you say, even setting aside a kind of academic perspective, it's such a watchable film. Like it looks so beautiful. The performances are so good. It kind of zips along. It's like 80 minutes, and it's a really fun, effective little thriller, I think, as well, isn't it? It's great.
Absolutely. I mean, Siodmak just knew how to make a movie.
Yeah.
You know, he was really one of the greats working in you know, across genre, but especially with these kind of darker films. You know, he was just in his element. He really knew his stuff. And it is that lovely feeling when you watch an old classic film that you're in the hands of a master.
Right.
Like, you know, I think with Siodmak, you really are as much as you are with somebody like Hitchcock.
100%.
It's like this guy knows exactly how to pull a film together. And, you know, things like those spatial dynamics that you don't consciously register. You know, there's so many moving parts at play in this film.
Yeah.
It's just a great experience.
I agree. And I think there's something about, you know, I think something that really goes underappreciated often when we watch films is how good directors can really create a sense of geography within a space. And it's so important, obviously, to this subgenre that we get a clear indication of the geography of the home, you know, and where we are at any given time. I think you need that for the tension, right? It's one of the things that I think Wes Craven was incredible at. And we're going to be talking about quite a lot of Wes Craven films later on down the line. But, you know, when you look at, for example, the original Scream movie in comparison to the new ones, and I like the new ones directed by different filmmakers, but the difference is you can see that they just haven't got as good a grasp of that sense of space in the way that Wes Craven did. He took his time to establish the geographical space before he added the horror. And I think that's actually so important, right? And underappreciated. And I think the spiral staircase gets it so right. Everything about this house, the space, the staircase itself leading down to that basement. I love being in this space, you know?
I definitely agree. I think the last Halloween film too really suffered with that sort of lack of spatial awareness.
Yeah.
You know, it sort of felt almost spatially flabby.
Right.
That you weren't really sure how spaces related to each other. So you didn't have that central sense of place. So that when that place was under threat, it's like I don't, you know, you're not sort of tethered to that space. Whereas a film like this, obviously, that's predominantly set in one house. It's extraordinary, as I said, you know, that flipping the planes of action. It's such an elegant, really simple but really elegant way to sort of play with that sense of spatial awareness and really untether us from that sense of being in a solid space. Really, really interesting stuff.
I had the most beautiful dream. It was the perfect day. And all I could think about was how much I wanted to cut you all open and then climb inside your bodies so that we could stay one happy family.
That was a little clip you just heard there from the new Evil Dead movie, Evil Dead Rise, which is out in cinemas this weekend. And a perfect opportunity for me to plug yet another podcast that I've been making. Because, you know, I feel like there's not enough podcasts with my voice on right now. So if you want more, then you can check out Dead by Dawn, an Evil Dead podcast. It's produced by me and Annabelle Gutskaya. Of course, we did the Hello Sydney podcast together about the Scream franchise. This is something very similar where we have covered the whole Evil Dead franchise. We're joined by the brilliant Chris Hewitt from Empire, who is of course an Evil Dead superfan, and the three of us go through each of the classic Evil Dead movies, from the original Sam Raimi trilogy to the 2013 Fede Alvarez movie, and of course we discuss in depth, in spoilerific detail, Evil Dead Rise, which is out this weekend. So if you want to listen to all of those discussions, please do hit that subscribe button. Drop us a little rating or review as well if you get a chance. It's always great to get some support for a new podcast. Check out Dead by Dawn, an Evil Dead podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, and I will link to it in the show notes. That was a little clip you just heard there from one of the most horrific music videos ever made, Aphex Twin's Come to Daddy. And if you've seen that video, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And that's a little teaser of what we've got coming up on Patreon next week. Next week, we've been wanting to do this for absolutely ages. Next week, we are bringing patrons a music video special where Rob Watts and I are going to discuss the history of horror in music videos. And we're going to list through some of our favourites and some listeners' favourite horror music videos. So we cover everything from Michael Jackson's Thriller to, of course, Aphex Twin to Prodigy to a bit of Radiohead to Fever Ray to Tool to Marilyn Manson and loads of other problematic artists that made some incredibly dark, twisted music videos. It was an incredibly fun discussion to have. We got loads of great engagement from listeners on that one. So that episode is going to drop for $5 patrons next week. So if you want to listen to that and a whole back catalogue of other bonus episodes, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolution of horror. If you sign up at a $10 level, you'll also get access to our exclusive mini seasons. Right now, we are doing a Final Destination mini season. I'm going to be joined by different guests each episode, and we're going to be discussing each of the 5 Final Destination films in depth, which is incredibly fun. We also continued our international horror mini-season, and we talked about Czech horror a couple of weeks ago, which was really interesting. And earlier this week, we continued our Legends of Horror mini-season, and I was joined by Becky Dark to discuss the life and work and career of the great Tom Savini. So that is just a little snippet of all of the stuff you can access across different tiers on Patreon. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. Everybody who signs up, no matter what tier you sign up to, will also get a shout out on the main podcast as a thank you. So speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of March a little thank you. So a big thank you to Ashley Walker, Alexander Toich, Gary McCarthy, Harry Evans, Geraint Blunden, James Hellier, Michael, Poe Walsh, Alex Maslin, Jennifer Marsh, Kristen Pringle, Robert Ralphson, Vitreous Humour, Jens Olsen, Benjamin Barron, Robert Hart, Ethan Millsap, Hannah Jane Smith, Jessie, Sarah Hodgson, Helen Donnelly, Computer, Nicole Slaw, Nago, Jacob Morrow, Kevin Zimmerman, Harley Alexis, Jill, Laura Mulligan, Kim French, Michelle McDermott, Chris McIntyre, Stephen Toussaint, Manuel Aracas, Amanda Arietti, Aaron Perleone, Scott Rigby, Ryan, Chris McLeod, Matt Shelton, Rian, Martin Matthews, The Garts, Jorgen Apenes, Lauren James Morton, David Finlayson, Eon Bella, Stacey Cranmore, Club Matai, Chakagon, Emily Cox, Bobby Bear, Melanie Hamilton, Vicky Osterweil, Chris Tinsley, and Amanda Collis. A huge thank you to all of those people. Apologies if I massacred your name. And one more time, if you want to join them and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of my conversation with Alexandra Heller-Nicholas as we move into the 1950s to discuss Alfred Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder.
You're trying to blackmail me into murdering your wife?
Hello? 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 Hello?
Okay, so there's a guy called Tony, played by Ray Milland, who plans to murder his wife. He wants to get her money, and he finds out that she's been cheating on him. But on the night that he's planned for this to all happen, he's got like an old friend from uni to kind of do the job. Basically, things go pear-shaped, and the man that Tony has sort of blackmailed into killing his wife ends up being killed himself.
Mm-hmm.
And the wife, Margot, Grace Kelly, is charged with his murder. And so the film is sort of unraveling things from there. So it's all really filmed in the one location, except for like a few scenes that are a bit more abstracted. But it's very much this sort of central place. You know, the apartment where all of this action takes place is really central.
Absolutely. So what do you think of this movie, Alex? How does it compare to other kind of Hitchcock horrors and thrillers that he was making at this time?
I mean, it was in a way, it's almost like a transitional film for me. I mean, on one side, you've got Strangers on a Train and I Confess. And on the other, we have things like Rear Window, To Catch a Thief, Trouble with Harry, Man Who Knew Too Much, those really big ones. And yeah, like I think Rope is a really interesting film to talk about in relation to this.
Yeah.
So Rope, I think, was 1948. It was also adapted from a play, a 1929 play by a guy called Patrick Hamilton. And, this Dial M for Murder was adapted from a play written by a guy called Frederick Knott, who I think also wrote the play of Wait Until Dark.
That's right, yes. And
so he's sort of quite tethered in an interesting way to this stuff. So, yeah, I don't hate this film, but I have to say I do tend to look at it sort of purely from a critical, it's an interesting film. And the 3D, I think that this was originally shot in 3D. I do look at it in a technical way, in the same way that you might look at something like Rope.
Yeah.
The idea of the single shot that he was trying to do with that film.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a technical curio, I think.
Agreed. I agree with you. It's not one of my favourite Hitchcock films. It never has been. But I think, and I think for me, Rope is still more successful as a kind of play, brought to film than this. It is interesting the ways in which Hitchcock does, make these plays more cinematic by using these different kind of tricks and techniques or gimmicks almost, I suppose, like the single shot thing in the single take thing in Rope or the 3D thing in Dial M for Murder, right? It's interesting that he's trying to find these ways to kind of make them more visually interesting, I suppose, which is, yeah.
I mean, you very much get the feeling, I think, more with Dial M for Murder than with Rope, that this is a technical exercise.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that it's a terrible film, but I think I saw it for the first time on 3D. So it was like a film, like a cinema screening that showed it in 3D, which was great. And the film is, I think it's very funny.
Yeah.
And when you have the 3D aspect to it, it is a bit of a, it's just a fun movie. And there's something about it that this sort of, I think these sort of more comedic elements sit in this really curious tension that's not necessarily always successful, but I think there's a really deliberate attempt, I think, here to balance comedy and the drama, and the darkness, which is something I always forget how funny this film is.
Yeah, there is something of a British Sunday night television play about it, I think, or something like tonally even, as well as stylistically. Do you know what I mean? Like there's something almost quaint about its kind of, I don't know, there feels like something very British about it too, in a way, but also there's that, like you say, that comedy, that kind of quite gentle comedy, actually, in a way, even though it is quite a grisly murder story in a lot of other ways, Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the film, I think Hitchcock's very knowing. There's a moment in the film where Grace Kelly's character she says that she's going to stay home while Tony, her husband, and her lover Mark are going out to, I think, a party.
Yeah.
And Tony's like, oh, you can listen to your regular radio show. And she says, oh, I don't want to. It's a thriller and I don't like thrillers.
Yes.
So there's this sort of knowing playing, this very sort of this in-joke about genre.
Yeah, 100%.
That's very sort of self-aware from within the text itself.
What was it like in 3D? I've never seen it in 3D. How 3D was it?
Yeah, I mean, the murder scene, especially when she reaches her hand towards the camera. So she sort of lies back on the table and, she's reaching for the scissors. I mean, that's like, up there with like classic 3D moments.
Yeah.
That's the only moment that I can remember being really like, oh, wow, in awe of. And it's weird in a way because there's not a lot of dynamic action in the film. Like that's really it. So to do it in 3D was a sort of interesting choice because there's not a lot of depth. But I think just the novelty, wearing the kind of goofy glasses and, the experience of watching 3D, is fun. And I think that for me, that really kind of amplified the sort of the more lighthearted elements of the film. And
there's that interesting kind of sort of weirder sort of burst of colour moment in the middle when she is sentenced, right? Which is in the court, and it's a little bit more, there's those kind of striking reds and those sort of colours when we kind of momentarily sort of leave the flat, I suppose, which I kind of thought, oh, is he doing something fun if you're watching that in 3D there in that moment? But I wasn't really sure. Yeah.
It's a really interesting little sequence.
Yeah.
It almost has the sort of the energy of the flashbacks in Vertigo. They're so stylistically sort of wacky compared to the rest of the film. But I don't know if they work for me, I have to say. Every time I see it, it almost feels like they're sort of almost like how are we going to do this bit of the film? Oh, I know. It always feels a little bit tacked on.
It does.
And maybe that's because the bar is so high for Hitchcock. But and again, it's just spatially, there's this sort of spatial weirdness that it's like this doesn't really fit, with the rest of the rest of my sense of space with this film.
Agreed. Yeah.
So they look beautiful in and of themselves, but I'm not sold that they're the most effective part of the film.
No, because there are these beautiful visual choices that he makes in Rope, for example, where you get, night falling in that city sort of scope, sort of landscape in the background and the lights dimming and then the red and green sort of neon lights flashing through the window towards that final act and everything. And I feel like he does come up with these kind of cool, interesting, dynamic visuals in that film that, again, maybe this movie, he didn't quite get the chance to do that, I think, in this particular story and in this particular setup, which is a shame.
Yeah, I mean, I'm speculating, but it does make me think that it's really more of a technical exercise.
Yeah.
This sort of playing with the 3D, playing with that technology and those ideas rather than anything. I guess first and foremost, it's a technical exercise in the same way that Rope was.
What do you think of Grace Kelly in this as well? This was before Rear Window, right? Am I right in thinking? Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, I think it was so. right before it, actually, wasn't it? But what do you think of her in this?
She's sort of, whenever she's in a Hitchcock, it's sort of automatically elevated.
Yeah.
I think she's great. I think she just brings a certain gravitas to anything she does, and I think she does she does do sort of thrillers really well. I don't think it's as iconic, obviously, as To Catch a Thief or Rear Window, but I think, and again, compared to Rope, I think that the subject matter is not as meaty. With Rope, I think there was a sense of danger. It's like this is a really kind of subversive,
very subversive.
Thematically really subversive stuff that they were playing with. So there's that sense of danger that sort of riddled the film on a kind of meta level. This film doesn't have that luxury, I guess. I don't know if it's a luxury is the word, but it doesn't have that added dimension. And I think she brings a lot to it. The innocent woman accused of a murder.
Yeah.
The promiscuous woman as a point of as a central character is a really interesting one too. And that the film never sort of penalizes her for being unfaithful.
Yeah.
And I think she sort of pulls all those strands together into her performance and really kind of brings it all together.
Agreed. I
think she's the heart of the film.
Yeah, she is, and I kind of miss her in the second half because she's kind of is gone through most of the second half of the film, isn't she? Right until the end, and I do find that I sort of miss her. Not that the other performers are really good, but there is something about her, like you say, she feels like this kind of centerpiece, this heart of the film, of the story. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she is really missing, I think, from that second half, in that she becomes almost like there's a lot of talk about her. Mm-hmm. But she almost becomes an abstraction,
right?
In that she's present but also not present. So there's again this sort of weird spatial, and the only kind of idea that we have of where she is this weirdly kind of, this sort of, those red and green sequences that are her being sentenced.
Yeah.
So we don't really know where she is. She becomes this sort of abstracted figure,
right?
In
That's
the storyline.
Pretty interesting. Yeah. What do you think of the space itself? I mean, like we've sort of spoken about it. It's pretty stagey, I suppose, in a lot of ways. But this particular home, this kind of small London flat, I suppose, right? What do you think of that and the way that kind of adds to this particular story?
I think again for me, it just feels like such a transitional film.
Yeah.
So with rope on one side and Rear Window on the other.
Yeah.
You can really get the feeling that Hitchcock's nutting out the idea of space. He's really trying to get a handle on what can be done in a small space. Mm-hmm. Like I certainly don't think it's as effective as Rear Window. Mm-hmm. But again, in that idea of it as a transitional film, you really feel him experimenting with how much drama can I build into two rooms, really. So you have the sort of the living area and the bedroom, I think.
Yeah.
And you see the hallway, and I think that's really about it. Except for those other anomalous shots that we've talked about. I think you see the street from a window at one point.
That's
and there's the balcony just off the living room. But it's very tightly dedicated to this very, very small space. And I don't think that he gets out of it what he gets out of something like Rear Window. But I think this is the step to get there. You really get the feeling that he's working on these ideas and that he's getting there.
Agreed. And I think the way that the space is used in Rear Window, it's thematically so rich and interesting. We're looking in on these different characters and this idea of kind of spying and everything. Whereas with this movie, it feels like so much of it is literally just about the plot, right? A lot of the dialogue is about the plot, is about explaining how things work, about this kind of procedural element, and also even the space. When Hitchcock does sort of make decisions to focus in on a certain part of the apartment, or like give us a close-up of somebody picking something up, it's always to do with the plot, right? It's to do with a latchkey or a pair of tights or a telephone or whatever. It's kind of it's really concentrating on driving this mystery along, I suppose, isn't it, more than anything? Very
much. It's really, really focused on that minutia.
Yeah.
Like almost obsessively.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, like I find this film, it's almost impossible to watch this film and not think of it in relationship to Rope. And
it's true.
It's a Rear Window, because you get that he's just working through these ideas with space and action and this sort of transitional part of his thinking, and the minutiae in this, the scrapbook, the emphasis on her scrapbook, and
yes,
she has the scissors on the desk because she's been cutting out clippings, and it's like we actually don't really need to know that. Maybe there's just scissors there, but the painstaking obsessiveness that he has about these small details, it's almost like somebody repairing a clock. There's this sort of all these little cogs that he's so fascinated with. And I think it is, it's a film that is about that minutia.
Yeah.
Which, again, I think it's more developed in later films, which really perhaps narrowed down his focus on specific objects,
And how do you find the way in which it kind of unfolds the mystery? We've mentioned stuff like Agatha Christie and, even the Spiral Staircase, this element of us kind of trying to figure out the mystery, trying to figure out who did it, the kind of us playing detectives. Whereas, of course, Hitchcock famously doesn't really do that. He shows you the crime up front, right? And then it's about oh, will Tony get caught? And, you know, he does that kind of interesting thing when he's at his most successful, Hitchcock. You know, I feel like we tend to kind of almost kind of find ourselves siding with the murderers or the criminals, you know, and that kind of tension of, are they going to get caught or are they not? How did you find that, and the way that kind of this crime story, I suppose, plays out in this way throughout Dial M?
It's interesting, I think, because there is the will he get caught or won't he, you know, and we have that sort of moment of hubris where he, you know, there's a conversation early in the film where they're talking about the perfect murder.
Yeah. Classic. Yeah.
Right. And what I think is really interesting about this film is that we get the flip side. And in a way, I think Hitchcock's more interested in the flip side here. So it's not will the real, you know, will the real guilty party get comeuppance? I think we're more attached and we're more anxious about, will an innocent woman be executed?
Yeah, right.
So our emotional sort of connection to the film isn't so much about guilty or not guilty in terms of Ray Milland's character. It's more about her, which is interesting and it's unusual, I think, for his films. Not unheard of, but I do think it's almost like it sort of almost defetishizes the, you know, the art of murder that, you know, he's so famous for.
Yeah.
And I don't think that would be deliberate. And maybe that's why it is such a curious film in terms of how it sits in his filmography. Mm-hmm. Because I think ultimately we have this more sort of compassionate engagement with the idea of murder, you know, in that we really, you know, she's innocent and we don't want her to be, you know, executed. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of, as a spectator, I think that's where our allegiance lies. It's not this sort of, you know, all of that Hitchcockian rhetoric about, you know, the elegance of murder. You know, it's all in there, but that's not what we're connected to in this film.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's kind of scrappier, isn't it? It isn't, I mean, obviously it isn't a perfect murder. Like, it goes very, very wrong. And I think that's kind of interesting because the plan, I mean, like, Tony's whole plan is very, very, very complicated, it feels like. You know, the stuff with, like, swapping the latch keys and the phone call and everything has got to be so precise and exactly correct. You know, I remember the first time I watched this, kind of struggling to keep up myself with this very complex plan, and then all the things that go wrong with it throughout the process of the film, and figuring out where that latch key is at various points in the film and all of that. You know, it's actually quite a complex plot, isn't it, really, this murder? Yeah,
it is. It is. And it's, you can't, I really like Anthony Dawson, who plays Swan, who plays the ostensible killer, in that he kind of doesn't know what's going on.
Yes.
He's sort of, what are you talking about? You know, and he's sort of,
yeah,
he's there kind of quite begrudgingly as a part of it. And there's a sort of sense of bewilderment.
Totally.
I think that he brings to this sort of careful plan that Tony has. And I do think that it's almost absurd, you know, in the context of the sort of more lighthearted aspect of this film. There is a sense of the absurdity to the kind of nuance of Tony's manic plan.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like you. I sort of, you know, no matter how many times I've watched this film, I sort of fade in and out of my connection to the kind of, where's the key? Whose key is it? Oh, I don't know.
Oh my God. Oh, the swapping of the jackets because he's got to go to the police station and then he's got to go back again. Like, it really, I'm like, I've really got to keep up, you know, with this film because again, maybe compared to certain other films, this film does feel like it is actually just about its plot, you know, as well. Like, it really is about that kind of procedural detective uncovering the plot element, isn't it?
Yeah, very much.
More than anything else.
And Hubbard, John Williams as the chief inspector, he's great.
Yeah.
He's really great. You know, he's that very sort of British, you know, detective figure.
Yes.
He brings a lot of humor to the film, but he also, you know, I think that if we're kind of tethered more emotionally to Grace Kelly's character's experience, you know, we sort of bounce that off him and his, you know, his knowledge, you know, that kind of relief that we have that he knows what's going on. So, you know, the figure of the detective, of the police in this film is very very old-fashioned in a way. You know, although the police will come and solve everything and then we'll all be fine.
Yeah, no, totally. There is a feeling of a kind of a comfy Sunday night television play about it in a weird way, right? And even the horror itself is kind of soft, I suppose, right? You know, there is this moment, of course, where the murderer does come in, and there's those famous shots that we've all seen of him about to strangle her from behind and everything. But, again, it doesn't feel so much like this movie is kind of interested in that kind of horror or suspense maybe that some of his other movies famously had,
And it's interesting because it almost on that front it deliberately exposes that as being false. So it has all of the trimmings of home invasion, but we're given the information in quite a lot of detail. But it's not a home invasion. This is an act of domestic violence. So you can really feel there's a kind of teasing aspect, I think, to that. That it feels like a very sort of like it for all intents and purposes, a man that she doesn't know breaks into her house and tries to kill her.
Yeah.
But the film is sort of playing with and again in a very lighthearted way. I think it's really kind of we're in on the joke, and the joke is that it's the call is coming from inside the house. That it's her husband.
Exactly that, and that in itself, at its heart, is quite a dark concept, right? That this poor woman has no idea that her husband has spent a lot of time and money on planning to murder her, right? And and I suppose that's the case with so many Hitchcock films. They could be so fun and so light, but at the heart of them there is something really nasty and horrific, right? But it's all dependent on how Hitch chooses to tell us this particular story, I suppose.
Right, and I mean, I think for me the thing that I keep coming back to is that I really like the fact that she is an unfaithful wife.
Right, yes.
And at no point does that impact negatively on her in the film.
No.
It's like, well, we're fine with it. It's like, Ray Milland's a creep. Like, of course she's going to,
Totally.
Like, why wouldn't she? And it's quite interesting, I think, that there's nothing puritanical about her being punished or anything like that at all. It's actually very much on her side. And it doesn't flinch on that. There's never one moment where you think, oh, maybe, you don't feel sorry for him at any point.
No.
At any point. And nor should you, because, her cheating on him and him trying to kill her, they're not equal. They're not equal actions. But if you look at film history, the idea of the unfaithful woman or the slut, all of those kind of really negative representations, the idea of the punished woman. This film just rejects that completely. And Hitch obviously has a very complex relationship to the representation of women, especially blonde women. But I think in this film, I think there's genuine, like he's 100% with her. 100%. I mean, maybe that sadism is there, but I do think that this is perhaps one of his more compassionate films when it comes to the representation of women.
Yeah, you're so right about that. And actually, even the other characters, obviously, I think, we're supposed to, feel that Mark Halliday, Robert Cummings' character, is this kind of hero, right? So this guy that she's kind of having an affair with is actually this very, very decent, heroic man anyway. So she's better off with him anyway, in a way, right? But also, even when the inspector the detective finds out she's been having an affair with him, there's no judgment even then, is there? That's the thing. Like, even within the world of the film, it feels like you're right. There is no kind of sense of judgment or punishment going on there, which is interesting.
But Robert Cummings as Mark, I think, is really interesting because I don't like him. Like, the character is so weak, and I always watch the film and think, he's sort of the weak. He's like the real weak element here.
Yeah.
But I kind of wonder whether he's meant to be. That it's sort of like it's not about her cheating on, it's not about her meeting this amazing guy. It's just that her husband is such a piece of shit that it kind of could be anyone.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
You don't feel that it's this great passionate love story between Margot and Mark at all. Like, it's just like she's just, and even the way that that Tony tells the story to Swan about her cheating on him. It's like, well, he was a jerk, and he's like, she just sort of fell out of love with me because I was difficult, like she didn't like my lifestyle. And so it's not that things were completely fine and then she met somebody else. It's like things were kind of falling apart anyway.
Yeah.
And there's something about Mark that's almost disposable.
Yeah.
Or maybe not disposable, but ambivalent. I feel, and I don't know whether that's just me projecting that I'm not that into Robert Cummings' performance in this film, But he does feel like it kind of could be anyone.
And he's kind of on the back foot too, right? Like, he's the one that kind of doesn't seem to quite know what's going on throughout the film. Like, the detective towards the end is kind of 2 steps ahead. And obviously, you know, you've got Ray Milland's character who is kind of constantly working through how he's going to like get himself through this, and it always feels a bit like Mark is sort of a little bit kind of still struggling to figure out what's going on. And again, it's quite funny because he is a crime writer, right, as well, so I think that in itself is quite a funny little joke there, almost, isn't it, that he's the one that's kind of struggling to keep up, you know.
And he's like the classic amateur detective in a Hitchcock film, especially.
Yeah.
Who we see, you know, again, you know, Rear Window, you know, we have that really kind of classic figure of the amateur detective.
Yeah.
That Hitchcock really loves to work with. And, you know, the legacy of that amateur detective figure in Giallo is huge. Mm-hmm. It's probably the strongest influence of Giallo from Hitchcock, I would say, is the centrality of this amateur detective. And, you know, through things like Antonioni's Blow Up, you know, we have this really interesting figure because it's such an ambivalent figure. And Hitchcock, you get the feeling like he really loves playing with that. And Mark is really impotent as a director. As a detective. You know, he keeps sort of striking the pose that he's going to be the man that solves it.
Yeah.
And he just kind of misses on every point. And we have this very stuffy, very old-fashioned detective in the figure of Hubbard, who's on it.
Yeah.
You know, he's the one doing all of the sexy detection work. And, you know, all the big reveals are coming from this sort of quite stiff, stuffy old guy rather than this sort of hip, you know, American crime writer. And I think that's very funny, and I think it's very playful. I think that Hitchcock clearly is like, I've not read the original play, but you do get the sense that that's something that he's really amplifying. You know, the idea of Mark being this relatively impotent character.
Yeah, no, that's so true, actually. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but you're so right. Well, there you go. I mean, it doesn't feel like there's like a huge amount more to say about Dial M for Murder, really. I mean, is there anything else that we've missed that you want to mention on Dial M before we wrap up?
Look, I think it's fun, and I think that it really does make the most sense. I mean, I think I've never done it, but I'd be really interested to watch Rope, Dial M for Murder, and Rear Window. I think those 3 films would be a really interesting trilogy to watch together.
They would. A kind of weird, a sort of apartment trilogy, yeah.
Right. And I feel that Dial M for Murder is the transitional film between Rope and Rear Window. So I think that it's the value of this film doesn't necessarily come from how it stands on its own merits. It's fine, but I don't think I don't think of this as one of Hitchcock's great films. Whereas, I mean, Rope, I know that, you know, he was quite unhappy with the success of it as a kind of formal experimentation. But I think Rope's amazing, and I think, you know, the subject matter of Rope too is really electric. You know, dealing with this sort of queer relationship and the dynamics there is really, you feel that kind of, this is a really dangerous film.
100%.
You know, not both thematically and formally. You know, he's trying to do something really quite radical here.
Yeah.
And you don't have that feeling here. Here, you just really get the feeling that it's this sort of, he's sort of working through ideas that he might have got from Rope to move on to Rear Window.
Yeah.
So I think that it really functions best as a kind of piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I completely agree. And do you think that it has had much of a lasting legacy beyond that? You know, we talked about how The Spiral Staircase feels like it must have inspired, or it feels like it was such a forerunner to so many other films. Do you think that's the case with Dial M in any way?
I don't, but I do. I think again, like, I come back to that figure of the amateur detective, this sort of ambivalent representation of the amateur detective, especially in an Italian film.
Yeah.
You know, I think of David Hemmings, not just in Blow Up, but of course in Deep Red, probably one of my favorite impotent amateur detectives. You know, he's so, and, you know, literally impotent in that film too. You know, he's so hopeless. I do think that of all Hitchcock's film, this is probably one of the ones where he's the most ambivalent about the amateur detective. So I think that's the interesting kind of kernel that I would sort of glean from this film. I don't know whether it's direct, but I think in the context, again, of all of Hitchcock's work, I think this figure of the amateur detective is he's doing something really interesting with that in this particular film.
Yeah. completely agree. I completely agree. And I think you're right. Next week we're talking about Rope and Rear Window. And I think, they're going to be a very interesting pairing to talk about together, but also in relation to this movie. I think you're absolutely right. And in a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to be doing Wait Until Dark. So obviously that kind of Frederick Knott connection as well is there. But I think this is the thing about Dilemmas, as fun as it is, and I do think it's really fun, and even the worst of Hitchcock is again, it's so watchable, this movie. It's fun and it's watchable. Right. But I think you're right. I think there are elements in this that I think are better in other Hitchcock films, are other in better Frederick Knott adaptations, So I think it's slightly the lesser in that regard.
I suspect that the 3D element was that was what was really fascinating for him on this film, was really kind of playing with those sort of more technical aspects.
Amazing. Well, there you go. Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining me to discuss these two films. It's been so much fun. I'm going to finish with a question I've been asking everyone this series. Of all of the movies we've discussed that we've mentioned, home invasion in general, do you have a favourite from this subgenre? We've already mentioned it's a difficult subgenre, but you can sort of interpret home invasion however you want. But do you have a particular favourite? Would you say?
So I'm just going off the top of my head here. Forgive me if I don't get all the names right, but there's an exploitation film from the late 70s called Fight for Your Life. It's a kind of grindhouse blaxploitation film. With William Sanderson and Robert Judd in it. It's directed by Robert Endelson. And it's amazing. It is amazing. So it's, a bunch of guys escape jail. There's like a really racist white guy, kind of total redneck. There's an Asian guy and a Mexican guy. And they basically, it's a home invasion film. They take over the house of a black minister and his family.
Oh wow!
And it's nasty. It's so nasty. It's a rape revenge film. It's really vicious. But the racial politics in this film is like it really wears it on its sleeve. It's got the most incredible final shot, which I won't tell you about, but just the final couple of seconds of this film is visually spectacular. But I don't know whether they're on YouTube, but there was 2 trailers cut for this film. And one of them was called the black trailer and one of them was called the white trailer.
Wow.
And they're so interesting because the one, so the black trailer is like a kind of typical blaxploitation voice. And it's taken from the perspective of the family. Mm-hmm. And it's like, we have to fight for our family. We have to protect ourselves. Whereas the white one is this sort of very formal, stiff, voiceover that's like, society is out of control.
Wow.
And it sort of paints everybody with the same brush. So they're really interesting and they're clearly aiming for very different demographics based on this being an blaxploitation film. There's a lot going on. It is very nasty. So it's it's not a particularly pleasant film in any sense. And it's not one of those 70s so bad it's good and you can laugh through it. It is a genuinely nasty film.
Wow.
But I kind of love it because it does sort of wear its heart on its sleeve. The text is subtext.
Yeah, of course. I love that. I mean, it does sound really interesting. I might have to check that out. Fight for Your Life from 1977, right? Amazing.
That's the one.
Awesome recommendation. Thank you so much. Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining me. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast finally. And just tell people where they can find you and where they can find your work if they want to come and check out some of your books, anything you've written. Where's the best place for them to find everything?
I'm on Twitter and on Instagram. I'm pretty easy to find on both because I'm the only Alexandra Heller-Nicholas in the world. But yeah, that's where I kind of keep all my links and updates to stuff that I'm doing. That's probably the best way to keep track on what I'm up to.
Amazing. Alexandra, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And one more time, a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Alexandra Heller-Nicholas. So please do get in touch. Let us know what you thought of this week's episode and what you think of these 2 movies. Please drop me a line, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And don't forget, if you want to discuss this week's episode, this week's movies with fellow listeners, you can join the Evolution of Horror discussion group on Facebook, or you can join our Evolution Evolution of Horror Discord. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then, and next week we've got a bit of a Hitchcock extravaganza. It's going to be the final week of Hitchcock movies, and I've got two very exciting guests. Next week, filmmaker and film historian Mark Cousins will be dropping in to talk a little bit about Alfred Hitchcock and his new movie about Alfred Hitchcock. And then I'm going to be joined by friend of the pod and filmmaker Jen Handorf, and she is joining me to discuss two absolute Hitchcock classics, Rope from 1948 and Rear Window from 1954. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.